I want to start this off by saying that desperation makes you blind. It puts blinders on your logic and amplifies the part of your brain that says, it'll be fine, just take the money. If I hadn't been drowning in student debt and facing an eviction notice in Philadelphia, I never would have replied to that Craigslist ad. I would have scrolled right past it, just like any sane person would have. But I didn't, and that decision is the reason I sleep with the lights on now, 3 years later. The ad was vague, which should have been my first red flag. It was titled simply, Remote Property Caretaker/Renovator Needed. 3-month contract, $30,000 flat rate. 30 grand for 3 months of work. That was life-changing money for me. I emailed them immediately, attaching a portfolio of the carpentry and drywall work I'd done during my summers in college. I expected a scam, or at least a multi-level marketing pitch. Instead, I got a reply within 10 minutes from a generic Proton mail address. The sender, who signed off only as Mr. V, didn't ask for an interview. He didn't ask for references. He just sent a PDF contract and a set of GPS coordinates. The instructions were simple. Drive to a location deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. There was a property there called Echo Valley. It consisted of a main lodge and 3 smaller guest cabins. My job was to strip the interiors, remove all furniture and debris, and prep the walls for a construction crew that would arrive in the spring. I signed the NDA, which was aggressively strict about privacy and no social media, and 2 days later, I was packing my beat-up Ford F-150. The drive down was the easy part. It was the last hour that started to gnaw at my nerves. Once I turned off the state highway, the pavement turned to gravel, and the gravel eventually turned into a narrow, rutted dirt track that wound up the side of a mountain. The trees here were ancient and thick, their branches weaving together over the road to create a tunnel of eternal twilight. My GPS had died 40 minutes ago, leaving me to rely on the printed map Mr. V had emailed me. It was late October, and the woods were dead silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my tires on dead leaves. I remember checking my phone and seeing the signal bars drop from 1 to no service. I felt a sudden heavy pressure in my chest, that primitive instinct telling you that you are now officially out of reach of help. But then I thought about the $30,000, and I kept driving. I reached the gate around 4 p.m., just as the sun was dipping behind the ridge, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the valley. The gate was impressive, 10 feet high, wrought iron, with a heavy-duty padlock. I used the code Mr. V had given me. It clicked open with a satisfying thunk. I drove through, locking it behind me as instructed. The property was massive. I drove another mile down a private driveway before the trees finally broke, revealing a clearing. There it sat, the main lodge. It wasn't the dilapidated shack I was expecting. It was a sprawling 2-story log structure with a wraparound porch. It looked sturdy, almost majestic, looming against the darkening sky. But there was something wrong with the geometry of it, or maybe it was just the lighting. The windows were dark, staring out like hollow eyes. I parked the truck, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out. The silence hit me like a physical wave. You know how in the city there's always a hum? Traffic, electricity, distant voices? Here, the silence was aggressive. It felt like the woods were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do. I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning under my boots. I found the lockbox mounted next to the front door, punched in the second code, and retrieved a heavy brass key. My hand was shaking slightly. I told myself it was just the cold mountain air. I slid the key into the deadbolt. It turned smoothly, well-oiled. I pushed the door open and clicked on my flashlight, bracing myself for the smell of mildew, rats, and abandonment. But that's not what I smelled. The air inside was stale, sure, but underneath the musk, there was a scent I recognized instantly but couldn't place in this context. It smelled like cleaning chemicals. Specifically, a heavy, stinging scent of bleach masked by a cheap lavender air freshener. "Hello?" I called out. My voice died instantly in the thick air. I swept my flashlight beam across the room and froze. The ad had said I needed to clear out old furniture and debris. The living room wasn't filled with junk. It was immaculate. There was a leather sofa that looked brand new, a coffee table with a stack of magazines fanned out, and a fireplace that had ash in the grate. I walked further in, my heart starting to hammer a weird rhythm against my ribs. This didn't look like a renovation project. It looked like someone's home. I made my way to the kitchen, the beam of my light catching dust motes dancing in the air. On the kitchen island, there was a plate. I walked up to it, confused. It was a dinner plate. On it was a half-eaten steak and a pile of mashed potatoes. The food was covered in a thick, fuzzy layer of blue-green mold, solidified into a hard mass. A fork was resting on the edge of the plate as if someone had put it down mid-bite to answer a knock at the door. I stared at the moldy food, my brain trying to process the timeline. This had been sitting here for weeks, maybe a month. Why would someone leave a meal halfway through and never come back to clean it up? That's when I heard it. It came from the floor above me, a distinct, heavy thump, like a boot heel dropping against the floorboards. I froze, gripping the flashlight until my knuckles turned white. I held my breath, straining my ears against the silence. For 10 seconds there was nothing. Then, clearly, unmistakably, came the sound of a door slowly creaking open directly above my head. I stood there in the kitchen, paralyzed, the beam of my flashlight shaking just enough to make the shadows on the cabinets dance. My brain was firing off a dozen different scenarios, each one worse than the last. Squatters, meth heads using the remote location for a cook, or, God forbid, the owners themselves wondering who the hell just walked into their house. "Is anyone there?" I yelled again. "I'm the contractor. I was hired by Mr. V." Nothing but the settling of the house. The creak above me had stopped, but the door remained open. I knew it was open because the airflow in the house had shifted. I could feel a draft now, colder than the stagnant air in the kitchen, drifting down the stairwell. I couldn't just stand there. If someone was up there, I needed to know. If I was alone, I needed to verify it before I could even think about unloading the truck. I reached to my tool belt, which I hadn't taken off yet, and pulled out my framing hammer. It wasn't a weapon, but it had a 20-ounce head and a claw that could do some damage if I swung it hard enough. I moved to the stairs. They were wide, made of polished pine, and they groaned under my boots. I took them one at a time, pausing on every step to listen. Step, wait, listen. Step, wait, listen. When I reached the landing, the hallway stretched out to my left and right, lined with 4 doors. The second door on the left was wide open. I raised the hammer, took a breath, and swung the flashlight beam into the room. "Hello?" I yelled again, louder this time. The room was empty. The relief that washed over me was so intense I almost dropped the light. It was the master bedroom. Across the room, a set of French doors leading to a small balcony had blown open. One of the latches was broken, and the wind was catching the door, pushing it inward with a rhythmic creak thump. I walked over and wrestled the doors shut, jamming a chair under the handle to keep them closed. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself. "Just the wind, you idiot." But as I turned back to face the room, the unease crept back in. Just like the living room and kitchen, this room felt paused. The bed was unmade, the sheets tossed aside as if the sleepers had risen in a hurry. On the nightstand, there was a glass of water, half full, with bubbles still clinging to the sides. No, that was impossible. I looked closer. It was dust, a film of dust on the water surface. I shook my head. I was psyching myself up over nothing. The previous owners probably bailed on the mortgage, took what they could carry, and left it for the bank. It happens all the time. That explained the moldy food and the mess. They just walked away. I went back downstairs, feeling slightly more confident. My first order of business was to get the power on. I found the breaker box in a utility closet off the mudroom. I flipped the main switch, and with a loud thrum, the house came alive. The refrigerator compressor kicked on, the overhead lights flickered into a harsh yellow glow, and the menacing shadows retreated into the corners. With the lights on, the place looked less like a haunted house and more like what it was, a messy, abandoned mansion. I spent the next 2 hours unloading my gear. I decided to set up my base camp in the living room. I wasn't about to sleep in that master bedroom, and the other guest rooms were filled with boxes and, frankly, creepy dolls and old toys that I didn't want staring at me. The living room was open, had huge windows so I could see the approach, and I could lock the doors. I set up my cot, rolled out my sleeping bag, and fired up a portable propane heater to chase away the chill. By 9 p.m., I was exhausted. The drive, the adrenaline spike, and the physical labor had drained me. I sat on the edge of my cot eating a sandwich I'd brought from a gas station and looked around the room. Now that I was settled, I started looking at the job itself. Mr. V wanted the place gutted. Drywall stripped, carpet pulled, furniture trashed. I walked over to the wall nearest the hallway to inspect the drywall. I'm a carpenter. I know what normal wear and tear looks like. I ran my hand over the wall. It was creamy beige, but the texture was uneven. There were patches, bad ones. Someone had used a heavy grit sandpaper and hadn't feathered the edges. I looked closer. There were holes, small circular indentations that had been filled with spackle and painted over. They were about chest height. I moved down the wall. There was another one. And another. I frowned. It looked like someone had taken a hammer to the wall in a fit of rage. Or maybe... I stopped. My eyes drifted down to the baseboard. The carpet was a dark maroon, thick and plush, but right where the wall met the floor, the pile was matted down and stiff. It was darker than the rest of the carpet, almost black. I knelt down, touching the stiff patch. It felt crusty. "Wine?" I whispered. "Gotta be wine." I stood up, wiping my hand on my jeans. I tried to push the thought away. It's a foreclosure, I told myself. Angry ex-husband, maybe. Threw a wine bottle, punched the walls. That's why I'm here, to fix the damage. I decided to turn in. I needed to start early tomorrow. I double-checked the deadbolt on the front door, turned off the overhead lights, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep quickly, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I dreamed of the moldy steak in the kitchen. In the dream, the mold was growing, pulsing, spreading across the table and up the walls until it covered the windows. I woke up with a start. My eyes snapped open. The living room was pitch black, save for the moonlight filtering through the trees and into the large picture windows. I lay perfectly still, listening. What had woken me up? Then I heard it. It wasn't inside the house this time. It was outside. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It sounded like metal dragging against gravel. It was coming from the driveway, right where I had parked my truck. I slowly sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs again. I reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. I crept toward the window, staying low, and peered over the sill. My truck was parked about 20 yards away, bathed in the pale moonlight. There was someone standing by the tailgate. I held my breath, my chest pressed against the cold glass of the living room window. Outside, the figure by my truck didn't move. They were tall, dressed in dark, baggy clothing that swallowed their silhouette, making it impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. They were just a void against the moonlight. The scraping sound had stopped. The figure was standing by the driver's side door, leaning in close to the glass. They weren't breaking in. They were peering inside. They were looking at my things. My registration on the dash, my extra jacket in the passenger seat, the empty coffee cups in the holder. A surge of protective anger cut through my fear. That truck was the only thing I owned that wasn't in debt. It was my lifeline out of here. I grabbed my heavy Maglite flashlight, aimed it through the window, and clicked it on. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. "Get away from the truck!" The beam of light cut through the darkness and hit the figure square in the back. I expected them to bolt. I expected them to scramble into the woods like a frightened deer. They didn't. The figure slowly straightened up. They turned around with a terrifying, deliberate calmness. The light was too bright and the distance too far for me to make out facial features, just the shadow of a hood pulled low. They stood there, bathed in the beam of my flashlight, facing the house, facing me. They raised a hand, not in a wave, but in a pointing gesture. They pointed a gloved finger right at the window I was standing behind. Then they lowered their hand, turned, and walked into the tree line. They didn't run. They strolled as if they had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat on the cot with the hammer in my lap, jumping at every creak of the house settling. I kept the lights off, watching the yard, but the figure didn't return. When the sun finally crested over the mountains, washing the valley in a safe golden light, I felt foolish. Daylight has a way of making night terrors seem ridiculous. It was probably a local hunter, I told myself, maybe checking to see if the property was occupied so he wouldn't accidentally shoot toward the house. I went outside to inspect the truck. There was no damage, no slashed tires, no broken glass, but on the driver's side window, in the morning dew, there was a smear. It looked like someone had pressed their forehead against the glass, leaving a greasy mark where the skin had touched. I wiped it off with my sleeve, disgusted. Creep, I muttered. I needed to work. I needed to stay busy. I convinced myself that if I just focused on the job, the 3 months would fly by, I'd get my 30 grand, and I'd never have to think about Echo Valley again. I started in the living room. Mr. V's instructions were to strip the drywall down to the studs. I grabbed my pry bar and a sledgehammer. Taking a sledgehammer to a wall is therapeutic. I swung hard, smashing into the beige paint, crumbling the plaster. I focused on the section where I had seen the patched holes the night before. I wanted to see what was behind them. I smashed a hole large enough to get my hands in and ripped a sheet of drywall away. Dust clouded the air, choking me. I coughed, waving it away, and looked at the wooden studs revealed underneath. There were holes in the studs, splintered wood where something high velocity had punched through. Definitely bullets, I whispered. My stomach turned over. Whatever happened here involved gunfire. I kept working, moving down the wall. I ripped off another large section of drywall, exposing the space between the studs near the ceiling. That's when I saw the wire. It wasn't standard electrical wiring. It was thin, black cabling, run meticulously along the stud, stapled down with precision. It ran horizontally, drilling through the studs, connecting to something embedded in the drywall I hadn't torn down yet. I leaned in closer. The box was taped securely to the wood. On the front of it was a tiny glass circle.
A lens. I froze. It was a pinhole camera. The lens had been flush with the drywall, likely painted over or hidden in a way that made it invisible from the outside. I traced the wire back the other way. It went up into the ceiling. I grabbed my ladder and tore down a chunk of the ceiling drywall. The wire joined a bundle of other black wires, 10, maybe 12 of them, all snake-tied together, running like a nervous system through the bones of the house. I felt a cold sweat prickle on the back of my neck. These weren't security cameras. Security cameras are mounted in corners, visible, a deterrent. These were surveillance cameras, hidden, secret. Someone had wired this entire house to watch the people inside it without them knowing. I gripped my pry bar, a sudden paranoia seizing me. Are they on? I followed the bundle of wires. They ran across the ceiling joists and down into the wall that shared a border with the kitchen. I tore that wall open, ignoring the mess I was making. The bundle dropped down into the basement. I hadn't been to the basement yet. The door to the basement was in the pantry. I opened it, staring down into the darkness. A cool, damp draft floated up, smelling of earth and copper. I clicked my flashlight on. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid for doing it again. Silence. I walked down the wooden stairs. The basement was unfinished, a concrete box filled with shadows. In the far corner, I saw where the wires led. There was a workbench set up against the wall. On it sat a stack of servers and recording equipment. Green lights blinked rhythmically in the dark. Blink, blink, blink. They were active. I walked over to the desk. There was a monitor in the center,
currently asleep. I reached out and touched the mouse. The screen flickered to life. My breath hitched in my throat. It was a grid of 9 camera feeds. One showed the kitchen, one showed the master bedroom, one showed the bathroom positioned directly at the shower, and the center feed showed the living room. I was looking at myself. I stared at the grainy black and white image of myself standing in the basement looking at the monitor. Wait. No. I looked closer at the center feed. It wasn't the basement. It was the living room upstairs. But there was no one in it. I looked at the feed labeled Cam 04, basement. I saw my back. I saw me standing at the desk. But then I saw something else in the corner of the screen, hidden in the shadows behind the water heater, just 10 feet behind me. A pair of eyes reflecting white in the infrared camera light, watching me.
I didn't turn around slowly. I didn't ask, "Who's there?" again. The moment my brain registered those glowing eyes on the monitor, eyes that were peering out from the darkness just 10 feet behind my actual physical back, I spun around with the speed of a cornered animal. I swung the mag light like a weapon, the heavy beam slashing through the gloom of the basement. "I see you!" I screamed, the sound tearing at my throat. The beam hit the water heater. It hit the concrete wall. It hit the dusty floor joists. There was no one there. I stood there, panting, my heart feeling like it was going to vibrate right out of my chest. I spun back to the monitor. The feed from Cam 04 showed me, wild-eyed and terrified, pointing my flashlight at an empty corner. The eyes were gone. But they had been there. I was certain of it. I hadn't imagined the reflection of the infrared light on retinas. I moved toward the water heater, leading with the flashlight. The air behind the tank was different. It smelled sharper, like unwashed skin and stale tobacco. I kicked at a pile of rags on the floor and saw it, a small, square service hatch in the foundation wall, about 2 feet by 2 feet. It was slightly ajar, swinging gently on rusty hinges, a black, gaping mouth leading into the crawl space under the rest of the house. Something had been crouching there, and the moment I saw it on the screen, it had scrambled into the wall like a rat. I didn't investigate. I didn't try to be a hero. I turned and sprinted for the stairs. I took them 2 at a time, crashing into the door at the top and fumbling with the lock. I slammed the deadbolt home and, for good measure, dragged a heavy oak cabinet from the mudroom in front of the door. I was done. $30,000 or not, I was done. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter. I didn't bother packing my clothes. I didn't bother grabbing my tools. I just wanted out. I ran out the front door, leaving it wide open, and jumped into my truck. I cranked the engine. It roared to life, and I almost cried with relief. I threw it into reverse, spinning gravel, and gunned it down the long driveway. The trees blurred past me, reaching out like skeletal fingers, but I didn't look at them. I just stared at the road, waiting for the gate to appear. 10 minutes later, I saw it, the massive wrought iron gate blocking the exit. I skidded to a stop and jumped out, leaving the engine running. I ran to the keypad mounted on the stone pillar. I punched in the code Mr. V had given me. Beep, 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 bzz. Red light. I frowned, my hands shaking. I tried again, slower this time. Beep, 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 bzz. Red light. No, 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 I whispered. I tried a third time. Nothing. The keypad didn't even beep. The small LCD screen faded and went black. The power to the gate had been cut. I grabbed the iron bars and pulled. They were locked solid into the stone. I kicked the gate, screaming in frustration, but it barely rattled. The walls on either side were too high to climb, and even if I did, my truck was stuck inside. I was miles from the nearest paved road, miles from cell service, with no food or water on me. I looked at the mechanism. It was heavy-duty, industrial. I'd need an angle grinder or a blowtorch to get through it, and my tools were back at the lodge. The lodge. The house with the cameras in the walls and the thing in the basement? I had to go back. I had no choice. I needed my tools to break the gate, and I needed the satellite internet router in the lodge to send an email or make a Wi-Fi call. The drive back was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The
The sun was fully up now, a bright, mocking blue sky overhead, but the woods felt claustrophobic. When I pulled back into the clearing, the lodge looked different. It didn't look majestic anymore. It looked like a trap, a giant wooden cage sitting in a pool of sunlight. I parked the truck closer to the door this time, facing out, ready to run. I grabbed a tire iron from under my seat. This was my new best friend. I walked up the steps, my eyes scanning every window. The front door was still open, just as I'd left it. I stepped inside, the silence of the house wrapping around me instantly. "I know you're in here," I yelled, gripping the tire iron. "Come out!" Silence. I kept my back to the wall and moved into the living room. My laptop was still sitting on the coffee table where I'd left it. I needed to email Mr. V. I needed to tell him the deal was off and he needed to open the damn gate right now. I opened the laptop. The screen woke up. I froze. I hadn't left my email open. I had closed the browser before bed. But now, a video file was open on the screen. It was paused. The timestamp on the video was from 03:42 a.m. last night while I was asleep. I shouldn't have pressed play. I really shouldn't have, but my finger hit the spacebar before I could stop myself. The video showed me sleeping on the cot. The room was dark, lit only by the moonlight. At 03:44 a.m., the video showed movement. From the hallway darkness, a figure emerged. It wasn't the person in the baggy clothes I'd seen outside. This person was naked, pale, emaciated, their ribs pushing against their skin. They were crawling on all fours, moving with a disturbing spider-like fluidity. They crawled into the living room and crept up to the side of my cot. I watched in horror as the figure on the screen lowered its face inches from mine. It stayed there for a full minute, just hovering, watching me breathe. Then, slowly, it reached out a hand and stroked my hair. I gagged, clapping my hand over my mouth. The figure on the screen then turned its head and looked directly into the camera lens, the hidden lens I hadn't even found in the living room yet. It smiled, a wide, toothless grin. Then the video cut to black. A new window popped up on my screen. It was a chat box. A single message appeared, typing out character by character as if someone was writing it right now. "Mr. V, you are leaving too soon. The renovation isn't finished, and neither is dinner." I slammed the laptop shut so hard I heard the screen crack. The image of that pale, smiling thing inches from my face while I slept was burned into my retinas, superimposed over everything I looked at. But the message, "Neither is dinner," was what kick-started my heart into a frantic, erratic rhythm. I wasn't the renovator. I was the livestock. I didn't waste time trying to delete the files or reply to Mr. V. I grabbed the tire iron in my left hand. With my right, I scrambled through my pile of tools on the floor. I needed the angle grinder. It was a heavy-duty DeWalt, cordless, with a fresh diamond blade wheel I'd bought for cutting tile. It would take time, but it could cut through the hinges of the front gate. I found it, the yellow plastic cold and reassuring in my grip. I shoved a spare battery into my back pocket and stood up to run. I made it 3 steps toward the open front door when the sound started. It began as a low hum, vibrating the floorboards beneath my feet, and quickly escalated to a mechanical screeching that assaulted my ears. I spun around. Outside the massive picture windows of the living room, thick steel security shutters were descending from the eaves. They were heavy, industrial slats, sliding down the tracks with unstoppable force. "No!" I screamed. I sprinted for the front door, the only exit that didn't have a shutter. I was 10 feet away, 5 feet. I saw the heavy oak door begin to swing shut. There was no wind. It was moving with the smooth hydraulic resistance of an automatic closer I hadn't noticed before. I lunged for the gap, throwing my shoulder into the wood. I hit it hard, bruising my arm, but the door didn't budge. It clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. A split second later, I heard the heavy electronic clack, clack, clack of deadbolts engaging. Not just one, but 3 distinct locks firing into the frame from the top, middle, and bottom. I pounded on the wood with the tire iron, screaming incoherently, but it was solid core oak. I might as well have been hitting the side of a tank. Behind me, the living room plunged into darkness as the steel shutters hit the windowsills with a synchronized clang. The sunlight was gone. The only light came from the small LEDs on my power tools and the thin cracks of daylight fighting through the shutter slats. The house had sealed itself. I backed away from the door, swinging the tire iron wildly, waiting for an attack. The silence that followed the mechanical lockdown was heavier than before. It was the silence of a pressurized vessel. "Mr. V," I yelled into the dark. "Open the door. I'm done. I'm leaving." A speaker system, somewhere in the vaulted ceiling, crackled to life. It wasn't a voice this time. It was music. Soft, scratchy, classical music, something with violins, played at a low volume. It was mocking. It was background music for a dinner party. Then, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. Scrape. Thump. Scrape. Thump. It was the sound of the heavy cabinet I had dragged in front of the basement doorway being pushed aside. I had barricaded that door. I had put hundreds of pounds of oak between me and the basement, but whatever was on the other side was moving it. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust-filled air. I aimed it at the hallway leading to the kitchen. The cabinet slid another inch, then another. A pale hand, thin and skeletal, curled around the edge of the doorframe. Then another hand appeared near the floor. Then a third hand near the top. There wasn't just one of them pushing. There were three. The cabinet toppled over with a deafening crash, exposing the dark rectangle of the basement doorway. They spilled out into the hallway like insects. There were 4 of them. They were human, or they had been once. They were all naked, their skin a translucent, sickly white that spoke of years without sunlight. They were emaciated, ribs jutting out, but their muscles were ropey and taut. Their hair was patchy and long, matted with filth. But it was their eyes that broke me. They wore goggles, large black tactical night vision goggles strapped to their heads, making them look like insectoid monsters. They could see perfectly in the dark. I was the only one who needed a flashlight. They didn't rush me. They stopped at the end of the hallway, twitching, sniffing the air. The one in the front, a male with scars running down his chest, tilted his head. He made a clicking sound with his tongue, and the others mimicked it. Click, click, click. They were communicating. I realized with a jolt of terror that I was standing in the open living room, completely exposed. They were blocking the path to the kitchen and the basement. The front door was sealed. My only option was up. I turned and bolted for the stairs. Behind me, the clicking turned into a wet, guttural shrieking. I heard the slap of bare feet on hardwood, fast and rhythmic. They were coming. I took the stairs 3 at a time, stumbling, barking my shin on a riser, but scrambling up on hands and feet. I reached the landing and spun around, shining the light down. The first one, the scarred male, was already halfway up the stairs. He was moving on all 4s, his movements unnatural, his limbs splayed out like a lizard. When the light hit him, he hissed, shielding his goggles with a forearm, but he didn't stop climbing. I didn't have time to think. I raised the heavy DeWalt angle grinder in my right hand, I hadn't let go of it, and hurled it down the stairs. It was a desperate, stupid throw, but it connected. The heavy tool spun through the air and smashed into the crawler's face. There was a sickening crunch of plastic meeting bone. The man shrieked, losing his grip, and tumbled backward, taking the 2 behind him down in a tangle of limbs. I didn't wait to see if they recovered. I turned and ran down the upstairs hall. I needed a room with a heavy door. I needed a fortress. I slammed into the master bedroom, the one with the balcony. I kicked the chair I had wedged into the door handle earlier, slammed the door shut, and locked it. It was a flimsy interior lock, meant for privacy, not security. It wouldn't hold them for long. I dragged a heavy dresser across the floor, my boots slipping on the carpet, and jammed it against the door just as the first body slammed into it from the other side. Thud. The door bowed inward. Thud. "Let us in," a voice rasped from a hallway. It sounded like sandpaper on stone. It was the first time one of them had spoken. "Mr. V says it's time to eat." I backed away, chest heaving, looking for a weapon, an exit, anything. My eyes landed on the French doors leading to the balcony. The balcony? It was a 20-foot drop to a concrete patio. But maybe I could climb down. I ran to the glass doors and through the latch. I pushed them open and stepped out into the cold mountain air. I looked down. The drop was steep, but that wasn't the problem. Below me, standing on the patio, looking up with those glowing green night vision eyes, were 3 more of them. They were waiting for me to jump. I stepped back from the railing, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face. Below me, the 3 figures on the patio didn't scream or wave their arms. They just stood there in a tight triangle, their heads cocked upward, those green glowing lenses fixed on me. They were waiting for gravity to do their work for them. Behind me, the bedroom door gave a sickening crack. The dresser I'd wedged against it lurched forward a full 6 inches, scraping deep gouges into the hardwood floor. A hand, pale, dirty and tipped with black, overgrown nails, snaked through the widening gap, clawing blindly at the air. "Come back inside," the raspy voice hissed from the hallway. "It's warm inside." I was trapped between a fall that would break my legs and a room that was about to become a slaughterhouse. Panic threatened to seize my legs, to lock my knees and leave me freezing there until they took me. I had to force my brain to work. "Think like a builder," I screamed internally. "Look at the structure." I looked up. The lodge was built in the style of a grand Swiss chalet. The roof had a deep overhang, extending about 3 feet past the wall of the house to protect the balconies from snow. The eaves were lined with heavy copper gutters. Above that, the roof sloped steeply up toward the central chimney massive. It was my only chance. I jammed the tire iron into my belt. I stepped up onto the railing of the balcony. It was slick with frost and wobbled under my weight. I was 20 feet up. If I slipped now, I'd land right in the middle of the waiting party below. I reached up, my fingers brushing the cold copper of the gutter. I jumped, grabbing the lip of the metal. The gutter groaned, the brackets protesting the sudden weight, but they held. I swung my legs wildly, kicking at the log siding, trying to find purchase. My boots found a knot in the wood, and I heaved myself up. Just as my chest cleared the edge of the roof, I heard the crash below. The bedroom door had finally splintered apart. The dresser was shoved aside with the sound of tearing wood. I scrambled onto the slate tiles of the roof, gasping for air, my heart hammering so hard I thought I was going to vomit. I lay flat on the freezing slate, pressing myself against the slope, trying to disappear. Below, on the balcony I had just vacated, chaos erupted. I heard the wet slap of bare feet hitting the decking. "Where is he?" a voice snarled. It sounded wet, like the speaker had a mouthful of saliva. "Up," another voice clicked. "He went up." I didn't wait. I started crawling up the steep pitch of the roof on my hands and knees. The slate was icy, and every movement threatened to send me sliding back down to the edge. I aimed for the massive stone chimney in the center of the ridgeline. It was the only solid thing up here. I was halfway up the slope when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of claws on slate. Fast, much faster than I was moving. I risked a glance over my shoulder. 2 of them were coming over the gutter. They moved with a terrifying insectoid grace. Their limbs splayed wide to distribute their weight, their fingers and toes gripping the edges of the slate tiles like geckos. They were built for this. I was clumsy, heavy, and slow. They were closing the distance rapidly. I reached the chimney stack and pulled myself up to a standing position, wrapping my arm around a clay flue pipe for stability. I pulled the tire iron from my belt. The first crawler, the one I had hit with the angle grinder earlier, crested the ridge of the roof. His face was a ruin of blood and broken plastic. One of the lenses of his night vision goggles was shattered, revealing a milky, blind eye underneath. He hissed, crouching low on the peak of the roof, 20 feet away from me. "Nowhere left to run, builder," he wheezed. He sprang. He covered the distance in 2 bounds. I swung the tire iron with everything I had. It was a clumsy swing, but the adrenaline gave it force. The iron bar connected with his shoulder with a dull thud. Ideally, it would have broken bone, but he barely flinched. He tackled me, his momentum slamming us both against the rough stones of the chimney. The air left my lungs. His hands, impossibly strong, clamped around my throat. The smell of him was overpowering, rotting meat, sweat, and old blood. He snapped his jaws at my face, his teeth yellow and filed into sharp points. I gagged, flailing, my vision spotting with black dots. I couldn't breathe. He was squeezing the life out of me. My hand, still gripping the tire iron, was pinned between our chests. I couldn't swing it. I did the only thing I could. I jammed the end of the tire iron upward, blindly. It struck something soft. The crawler screamed, a high-pitched shriek that echoed across the valley. I had jammed the metal bar under his chin into the soft tissue of his throat. He recoiled, releasing my neck to claw at the metal. I shoved him hard with my boot. He lost his balance on the icy slate. He flailed, his claws screeching against the tiles, but gravity won. He slid backward, faster and faster, until he hit the gutter. His body flipped over the edge, and he fell into the darkness. A second later, there was a wet crunch on the patio below. I slumped against the chimney, coughing, massaging my bruised throat. But I couldn't rest. The second one was already cresting the ridge. I looked around desperately. I couldn't fight them all up here. I would slip, or they would overwhelm me. Then I saw it. About 10 feet down the other side of the roof, there was a dormer window jutting out. It was dark, but the glass looked old and brittle. I didn't hesitate. I pushed off the chimney and slid down the slate, using my boots as brakes. I hit the dormer hard, my feet slamming into the wooden frame. The crawler on the ridge let out a howl and started scrambling down after me. I turned the tire iron around, using the pointed end, and smashed the window pane. Glass shattered inward. I cleared the jagged shards with my gloved hand and dove headfirst into the hole, tumbling onto a dusty wooden floor. I scrambled to my feet and pushed a heavy stack of old trunks in front of the window, just as the crawler's head appeared in the opening. He slashed at the trunks, shrieking, but the gap was too small for him to squeeze through quickly. I backed away, panting, shining my flashlight around the room I had landed in. I was in the attic. It wasn't empty. It was filled with rows of cots, dozens of them. And on the wall opposite me, illuminated by my shaking light, was a map of the property. But it wasn't a normal map. It was covered in red markers, photographs, and strings connecting them. In the center of the map, pinned directly over the location of the main lodge, was a photograph of a man. I walked closer, my breath catching in my throat. The photo was of me. It was taken 3 days ago at a gas station 200 miles away. I stared at the photograph of myself, tacked to the corkboard in the freezing attic. It was grainy, taken with a long-range lens, but it was unmistakably me. I was standing at a pump at a Sunoco station off I-95, filling up my truck. I remembered that stop. It was 3 days ago. It was 400 miles away from here. My blood ran cold, colder than the mountain air whistling through the broken window. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. I hadn't just stumbled into a bad situation. I had been scouted. I had been tracked. I had been chosen. I scanned the rest of the board. Next to my photo was a printout of my Craigslist email. Below that, a copy of my credit score, which was abysmal, and a criminal background check, which was clean. They knew I was desperate for money. They knew I had no family in the area. They knew no one would come looking for me for at least a few weeks. "I'm not a contractor," I whispered, the realization settling in my gut like a stone. "I'm the main event." The sound of splintering wood snapped me back to reality. Behind the stack of trunks I had shoved in front of the dormer window, the crawler was making progress. A pale, bloody arm had punched through the gap, shoving the heavy luggage aside. It was hissing, a sound like a leaking tire, summoning the others. I spun around, sweeping my flashlight across the rest of the attic. Now that the shock of the map had faded, I saw the room for what it truly was. The rows of cots weren't for victims. They were for the hunters. The bedding was filthy, stained with brown fluids and matted with hair. The floor around them was littered with gnawed bones, deer, raccoon, and some that looked disturbingly like larger mammals. The smell here was concentrated, a thick ammonia stench of urine and raw meat. This was their nest. I had climbed out of the frying pan and into the fire's source. I needed a way out. The dormer window was blocked by the crawler. The only other exit would be the attic hatch leading back down into the house. I spotted it near the center of the room, a square wooden panel in the floor with a recessed pull ring. I ran to it, dropping to my knees. I grabbed the ring and pulled. It was locked, or jammed. "Come on," I grunted, heaving with both hands. It didn't budge. It was bolted from the underside. Of course it was. They didn't want their dogs getting loose in the house until it was time for the hunt. Crash! The stack of trunks by the window toppled over. The crawler spilled into the attic. It was the one I had injured, the one with the broken goggles. It shook off the debris, stood on its hind legs, and let out a shriek that vibrated in my teeth. It saw me instantly. I scrambled backward, frantically looking for a weapon. I still had the tire iron, but in this open space, against that thing's speed, it felt like a toothpick. I backed into a wooden work table in the corner. My elbow knocked over a metal box. It hit the floor with a clang, spilling its contents. Wallets. Dozens of them. They fanned out across the floorboards. Leather, Velcro, nylon. I glanced down. A Pennsylvania driver's license. A student ID from Ohio State. A library card. A picture of a smiling young woman and her baby.
These were the trophies, the personal effects of the contractors who came before me, the ones who didn't make it to the 3-month mark. The crawler dropped to all fours and charged. I didn't think, I reacted. I grabbed the heavy wooden work table by its legs and flipped it over just as the creature leaped. The table slammed into the crawler midair, pinning it to the floor for a split second. It thrashed and clawed, turning the table into sawdust, but it bought me 2 seconds. I saw a vent pipe running from the floor up through the roof. Next to it, the floorboards were loose, pried up as if someone had been working on the wiring. I jammed the tire iron into the gap between the boards and heaved. The old wood, rotted by the damp attic air, snapped. I kicked furiously, stomping a hole through the lath and plaster of the ceiling below. The crawler threw the table aside. It lunged for my leg, its claws hooking into the denim of my jeans. I yelled, kicking at its face with my free boot, and threw myself into the hole I had made. I fell. I plummeted about 10 feet, crashing through the drywall ceiling of the room below. I landed hard on a carpeted floor, the wind knocked out of me, debris raining down on my head. I rolled over, gasping, checking for broken bones. I was bruised, bleeding, and covered in dust, but I could move. I scrambled up and aimed my flashlight. I wasn't in a bedroom. I wasn't in a hallway. I was in a narrow, windowless corridor. The walls were unfinished plywood. The floor was covered in black rubber matting to dampen sound. On the left wall, at regular intervals, were the back sides of the surveillance cameras. I could see the wiring, the battery packs, and the small viewfinders. I was inside the walls of the house. This was the service tunnel used to maintain the cameras and the speaker system. This was how Mr. V watched without being seen. Above me, in the hole I'd fallen through, the crawler's face appeared. It couldn't fit through the gap between the joists. It snarled, reaching down, its fingers inches from my head. "Wrong turn, rat," it hissed. I didn't stick around to chat. I took off down the narrow corridor. It was claustrophobic, barely 2 feet wide, smelling of sawdust and electricity. The tunnel took a sharp right turn, then sloped downward. I was moving behind the walls of the second floor, heading toward the ground level. As I ran, I heard a voice. Not from the speakers this time. It was coming from the other side of the plywood wall to my right. It was a man's voice, calm, British accent. "Yes, the subject has shown remarkable resourcefulness, better than the last one. The roof maneuver was unexpected. I think he's worth a double down on the wager." I stopped. I pressed my ear against the plywood. "Agreed," a second voice replied. This one was computerized, synthesized. "Release the alpha. Let's flush him out of the wall void." I backed away from the wall, horror dawning on me.
I wasn't just being hunted by feral humans, I was being narrated. There were people watching, betting, and they knew exactly where I was. Suddenly, the narrow corridor ahead of me flooded with red light. A heavy iron door at the far end of the tunnel clicked and hissed open. From the darkness beyond the door, I heard the sound of heavy chains dragging on the floor and breathing. Heavy, wet, labored breathing that sounded more like a steam engine than an animal. "Release the Alpha," the synthesized voice had said. Something stepped into the red light. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall. It wore a metal mask bolted onto his skull, and in its hands it held a gas-powered concrete saw. He pulled the cord. The saw roared to life, spinning a diamond blade that screamed for blood. There is a specific kind of fear that hits you when you hear a two-stroke engine revving in a confined space. It's primal. It triggers a flight response so violent that you don't even realize you're moving until your legs are already pumping. The moment the Alpha pulled the cord and that concrete saw roared to life, the acoustics of the narrow service tunnel turned against me. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure wave that slammed into my eardrums. The air instantly filled with the stench of gasoline exhaust, thick and blue, mixing with the dust of the enclosed space. I turned and sprinted. The tunnel was barely shoulder width. I scraped my arms against the raw plywood and the sharp edges of the camera housings, but I didn't feel the pain. All I could feel was the vibration in the floorboards behind me. Vroom! The sound was getting closer. He wasn't just walking, he was charging. I heard a terrifying, high-pitched scream as the diamond blade made contact with something, a pipe, a nail, a stud. Sparks showered down the tunnel behind me, illuminating the smoke in jagged, hellish flashes. The tunnel sloped sharply downward, taking me toward the ground floor. I stumbled, catching myself on a bundle of wires, ripping them from the wall. Behind me, the Alpha didn't bother navigating the slope. I heard the saw bite into the floor, the sound of wood screaming as he cut through the obstacles in his path. He was a force of nature. He was carving his own hallway. I reached a dead end. I skidded to a halt, my hand slapping against a flat plywood panel. I frantically felt for a latch, a handle, anything. There was nothing. It was a maintenance seal, bolted from the outside. The roar of the saw was right behind me now. I could feel the heat of the engine on my back. I turned my head and saw the red silhouette of the Alpha through the smoke, the spinning blade a blur of destruction not 5 feet away. "Open!" I screamed, slamming my shoulder into the panel. The Alpha lunged. He didn't aim for me, he aimed for the wall next to my head. The saw sliced through the plywood like it was wet paper, missing my ear by inches. Dust and splinters exploded into my face. I dropped to the floor, rolling frantically between his legs. It was a suicidal move, but it was the only space available. His heavy boots stomped down, missing my ribs by a fraction of an inch. I scrambled backward on my elbows, kicking at his shins. He turned slowly, the saw idling with a menacing chug, chug, chug. He raised the blade, preparing to bring it down on my legs. I grabbed the bundle of loose wires I had ripped down earlier, the camera feeds, the power cables, and yanked them with both hands. A heavy junction box tore loose from the ceiling above him and smashed into the Alpha's metal mask with a resounding clang. He stumbled back, the saw dipping. The blade hit the floor, biting into the rubber matting and kicking the tool back toward him. He roared, a muffled human sound of frustration, and wrestled the machine back under control. I didn't wait to see if he recovered. I turned back to the wall he had just sliced open. I jammed my hands into the fresh cut, ignoring the splinters, and heaved. The drywall on the other side gave way. I fell through the wall, tumbling out onto a polished hardwood floor. I was back in the main house. I looked around. I was in the dining room, adjacent to the kitchen. The long mahogany table was set for a meal that would never happen. I scrambled to my feet. The hole in the wall behind me began to widen. The tip of the saw blade poked through, moving up and down, carving a doorway large enough for the giant to step through. I needed a weapon, a real one. The tire iron was gone, lost in the tunnel. I ran into the kitchen. The moldy steak was still there on the island, a grotesque reminder of how this started. I scanned the counters. Knife block. I grabbed the largest chef's knife, the handle cold and heavy. It felt pathetic against a concrete saw, but it was better than nothing. "Come on out!" the British voice boomed from the ceiling speakers. "The fox is in the open! Tally-ho!" The wall in the dining room exploded outward. The Alpha stepped through the wreckage, shaking dust from his massive shoulders. He looked even bigger in the open room. The metal mask was dented where the junction box had hit him, but he didn't seem slowed down. He saw me in the kitchen. He revved the saw. I looked at the front door, still barricaded, locked, and sealed. I looked at the windows, steel shutters down. My eyes darted to the hallway. The basement door. The heavy cabinet was still toppled over and the door was wide open. The crawlers had come from there, but the crawlers were loose in the house now, probably upstairs hunting me. The basement had the hatch, the service hatch behind the water heater that led to the crawl space under the house. It was a nightmare option, crawling into the dirt under the lodge. But the crawl space had ventilation grates. If I could kick one out, I could get to the yard, I could get to the woods. The Alpha charged. He brought the saw down on the kitchen island, slicing through the marble countertop in a shower of white dust and sparks. I backed up, putting the refrigerator between us. "Stay back!" I yelled, brandishing the knife. He laughed, a deep, mechanical sound amplified by the mask. He thrust the saw through the refrigerator door, severing the cooling lines. Freon hissed out in a freezing white cloud, blinding us both for a second. I used the cover. I threw the knife at his chest. It bounced harmlessly off his heavy leather apron and bolted for the basement door. I hit the stairs hard, sliding down more than running, my boots clanging on the wood. I reached the bottom and spun around. The Alpha appeared at the top of the stairs. He was too wide to move comfortably in the stairwell. He had to turn sideways. He raised the saw and began to cut through the banister, destroying the staircase as he descended, step by step, removing my escape route. I was trapped in the concrete box of the basement again. The monitors were still glowing green. I ran to the water heater. The small hatch was there, dark, smelling of wet earth. I got on my hands and knees. I could hear the Alpha halfway down the stairs, the destruction of the wood echoing like gunshots. I crawled into the hatch. The space was tight, barely 2 feet of clearance. The dirt floor was cold and damp. Spiderwebs brushed against my face. I shimmied forward, dragging myself by my elbows into the darkness under the house. I made it about 10 feet in when I heard the sound. It wasn't the saw behind me. It was a clicking sound. Click, 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 coming from the darkness ahead of me. I froze. I shined my flashlight down the length of the crawl space. 10 yards away, curled up in the dirt, their eyes reflecting the beam, were 2 of the crawlers. They weren't hunting upstairs. They were guarding the exit. Behind me, the Alpha kicked the hatch grate open. The roar of the saw filled the crawl space, vibrating the floorboards above my head. I was sandwiched. A monster with a saw behind me and a pack of cannibals in front of me. And I was lying on my belly in the dirt, unable to stand, unable to fight. Then the crawler in the front smiled. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me, at the Alpha squeezing into the tunnel. It raised a hand, holding something small and metallic. A lighter. And that's when I smelled it. The dirt under me wasn't just damp. It was soaked. Gasoline.
There is a moment before a fire ignites where time seems to stretch. You see the spark, you smell the fumes, you know what's coming, but your brain refuses to process the magnitude of it. The crawler's lighter hit the dirt. It didn't start as a flicker. It was a concussion. The gasoline-soaked earth erupted with a sound like a jet engine taking off inside a tunnel. Whoosh! A wall of blue and orange flame raced across the crawlspace floor, moving faster than thought. It rushed toward me, hungry for the oxygen I was breathing. I didn't have time to turn around. I didn't have time to think about the Alpha behind me with his saw. I jammed my face into the crook of my elbow, squeezed my eyes shut, and rolled.
The heat was instantaneous. It felt like someone had opened a blast furnace door against my back. I screamed, the sound lost in the roar of the fire. The flames licked over my jacket, singing my hair, but the heavy denim protected my skin for that crucial first second. Behind me, the crawl space turned into a slaughterhouse. The Alpha was wedged in the narrowest part of the tunnel, blocking the exit. The gasoline fumes, concentrated in that tight space, ignited around him. Worse, he was holding a running internal combustion engine. I heard a muffled explosion, the gas tank of the concrete saw rupturing in the heat. The Alpha didn't scream like a man, he roared like a wounded bear, a sound of pure mechanical rage and agony. The saw clattered against the stone foundation, spinning wildly, biting into the support beams, shaking the entire house. I scrambled forward on my belly, dragging myself through the dirt that was now hot enough to blister my hands. The fire was eating the oxygen. The smoke was thick, black, and oily. I couldn't see the crawlers anymore. They had likely scurried out the moment the lighter dropped, but I knew where I had to go. The ventilation grates. I crawled blindly, coughing violently, my lungs burning with every breath. I felt the rough stone of the foundation wall against my left hand. I followed it, feeling for the metal grate. Stone, 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 metal. I found it, a cast iron grate, rusted into the frame. I rolled onto my back, ignoring the searing heat of the ground, and kicked upward with everything I had. My boot connected with the iron. Clang! It held. "Come on!" I screamed, choking on the smoke. I kicked again, and again. My vision was tunneling, gray spots dancing in front of my eyes. The heat was unbearable. My clothes were starting to smolder. If I didn't get out in 10 seconds, I was going to cook in my own skin. I coiled my legs back, screamed a primal, desperate sound, and unleashed one final kick. The rusted bolts sheared. The grate flew outward into the yard. Cold, fresh air hit my face like a blessing. I shoved my head and shoulders through the small opening. It was tight, too tight. My hips snagged on the jagged frame. I clawed at the grass outside, pulling until my fingernails broke. I wiggled, twisted, and heaved. With a sound of tearing fabric, my pants ripped free, and I tumbled out onto the wet grass of the lawn. I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, coughing up black soot, and ran. I made it 20 yards before I collapsed, turning back to look at the lodge. It was a vision of hell. The fire had climbed the walls instantly. The main floor was already glowing orange. Smoke poured from every seam of the structure. The steel shutters on the windows were warping, buckling under the intense heat inside. From the hole I had just crawled out of, a hand emerged. It was massive. Glove melted to the skin. The Alpha dragged himself out of the burning crawl space. He was on fire. His leather apron was flaming, his mask was glowing red hot, and his skin was a charred ruin. But he was still moving. He pulled himself free of the foundation, standing up slowly, a burning giant against the backdrop of the inferno. He saw me. He didn't run. He couldn't. He shambled toward me, a walking corpse fueled by nothing but the desire to kill. I scrambled backward, finding my footing. "You're dead!" I yelled hysterically. "Just die!" He kept coming. I spun around and sprinted toward my truck. It was still parked near the front steps, perilously close to the burning porch. The heat was blistering as I grabbed the door handle. It was locked. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them in the gravel. "No, no, no!" I dropped to my knees, frantic, patting the ground. The orange glow of the fire illuminated the silver key ring. I grabbed them, jammed the key into the lock, and threw the door open. I dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door just as a heavy weight collided with the side of the truck. The Alpha. He slammed his fists against the passenger window. The glass spider-webbed but didn't shatter. I looked over and saw his mask, right there, the metal bubbling, his eyes boiled white but still staring at me. I cranked the engine. The Ford roared to life. I threw it into drive and floored it. The truck lurched forward, knocking the Alpha off balance. He fell away, disappearing under the rear wheels with a sickening thump crunch. I didn't look back. I sped down the driveway, the gravel spraying like bullets. The burning lodge shrank in my rearview mirror, a funeral pyre for the twisted game I had been trapped in. But I wasn't out yet. The gate. The massive wrought iron gate was still locked. I hit the straightaway leading to the exit. I could see the gate looming ahead in the headlights. I had a choice: slow down and try to figure something out, or bet my life on the engineering of a 2004 Ford F-150. I looked at the speedometer. 40 miles per hour. 50 miles per hour. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather creaked. "Please," I whispered. I didn't touch the brakes. I accelerated. The gate rushed toward me. I braced myself for the impact, tucking my chin, my body tense for the collision. The truck hit the iron gates doing 60 miles per hour. The sound of a 2-ton truck hitting a wrought iron gate at 60 miles per hour isn't a crash. It's an explosion. I don't remember the actual impact. My brain edited that split second out to protect itself. One moment I was staring at the intricate iron scrollwork rushing toward the windshield, and the next I was choking in white powder. The airbag had deployed, punching me in the face with the force of a heavyweight boxer. My ears were ringing so loudly I couldn't hear the engine, but I could feel the vibration. I was stopped. The truck was listing heavily to the left. I slapped the deflated bag aside, gasping for air, blinking the dust out of my eyes. I looked back. The gate was decimated. The sheer force had ripped the hinges right out of the stone pillars. The iron was twisted into a mangled heap of metal spaghetti on the gravel road behind me. I looked forward. The hood of my truck was crumpled like a piece of tinfoil. Steam was hissing from the radiator, but the engine was still turning over. I put my foot on the gas. The truck groaned, metal grinding on metal, but it lurched forward. I didn't care about the damage. I didn't care if I was destroying the suspension. I drove. I drove down that mountain on 3 tires and a rim, the truck shaking so violently my teeth chattered. I watched the rearview mirror the entire time, expecting to see headlights, expecting to see the burnt, skinless form of the Alpha running down the road after me. But there was nothing. Just the red glow of the fire above the tree line, staining the night sky like a bruise. I made it to the state highway 40 minutes later. The moment my tires hit the pavement, I started crying. I couldn't stop. It wasn't relief, it was a total physiological collapse. I drove until the engine finally seized up and died in the parking lot of a 24-hour Waffle House 10 miles outside of Asheville. I stumbled inside, covered in soot, blood, and burns, smelling like gasoline and death. The waitress dropped a pot of coffee when she saw me. I collapsed into a booth and waited for the police. The investigation that followed was a blur of hospitals and interrogation rooms. I told them everything. I told them about Mr. V, the cameras, the crawlers, the Alpha, the trophy room in the attic. They didn't believe me. Not at first. They thought I was on meth. They thought I had burned the place down in a drug-induced psychosis. But then they went up to Echo Valley. The lodge was gone. It had burned to the foundation. The fire was so hot it had cracked the concrete slab. But the fire investigators found things. They found the tunnel system behind the walls, the charred remains of the camera mounts. They found the trophy room debris in the attic, though most of the IDs were ash. And they found bones. Not just in the attic, but in the woods surrounding the property. Dozens of shallow graves. The forensics team estimated the site had been active for over 10 years. But here is the part that keeps me awake at night, the part that makes me check the 3 deadbolts on my apartment door every night before I sleep. They never found the Alpha. They found the burnt wreckage of the concrete saw in the crawl space. They found pieces of the melted metal mask. But there were no human remains that matched his size. And the crawlers? Gone. The police found footprints, barefoot, human tracks, leading away from the fire and deep into the national forest. They tracked them for 5 miles before the trail vanished into a river. They cleaned up. Even while the house was burning, while I was driving down the mountain, someone or something was up there retrieving their assets. The FBI got involved. They traced the email address Mr. V used. It bounced through servers in Russia, then Brazil, then finally dead-ended in a crypto mining farm in Southeast Asia. The money trail was a ghost. The property was owned by a shell company that dissolved the day after the fire. I never got my $30,000. I live in Ohio now. I work in a warehouse, driving a forklift. It's loud, bright, and there are always people around. I like that. I don't go camping. I don't go hiking. I don't even like driving on roads that don't have streetlights. Sometimes, late at night, I browse the deep web. I tell myself I'm looking for justice, but I know I'm looking for validation. I'm looking for proof that it's over. Last week, I found a forum. It was buried deep, password protected, accessible only through a specific sequence of proxy servers. I didn't have the password, so I couldn't enter, but I saw the login screen. The background image wasn't black. It was a grainy, green-tinted night vision photograph. It showed a bedroom, a familiar bedroom. There was a man sleeping in the bed, and underneath the login box, there was a simple tagline in bold white text. Season 12, casting now. I shut my laptop and threw it in the trash. But I know it doesn't matter. The renovation wasn't about the house. It was about the show. And somewhere, in another remote cabin, in another dark patch of woods, the cameras are already rolling. Don't answer the ad. No matter how desperate you are, just don't answer the ad.